My name's Jason Rowe. I'm a freelance travel photographer and tutorial creator and writer for Photzy.com and for lightstalking.com. In today's video tutorial, we're going to have a look at one of the pillars of photography. It's one of the things that you need to understand, one of the fundamentals that you need to understand in order to take your photography to the next level. And that is shutter speed. So before we go any further, let's explain what shutter speed is. And to do that, we need to understand what a shutter is. A shutter is a mechanism that's built into your camera, and what it does is it opens and closes and exposes your sensor to light. Now, you preset the time that that shutter opens and closes. That is your shutter speed. Shutter speed is one of the 3 points in what's known as the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is what we use to determine what our exposure should be. The other 2 points are aperture and film speed. But for most images, we're using the shutter speed and aperture and balancing between the two to make sure we get enough light on our sensor. So let's have a look at some of the figures that you might see when you're actually setting your shutter speed. And typically they will be in tenths of a second. You might see 1/30th of a second, 1/60th of a second, 1/125 of a second, 1/250th of a second. What these numbers represent is the amount of time the shutter is open, and therefore the amount of time that light is exposed to your sensor. So let's have a look at what shutter speed means. Let's assume we have a camera that has a fixed aperture. We can't change the aperture. The only way we control the amount of light reaching our sensor is by the shutter speed. And if we want the perfect exposure, our shutter speed in this case is 1/125th of a second. So what happens if we use 1/1000th of a second? That shutter is open a much shorter period of time, and what will happen is not enough light will reach our sensor. And if that happens, what we're going to get is a dark or underexposed photo. If we take it the other way and say use a 1/30th of a second, then we're opening the shutter longer than should be required, and that means more light is coming on the sensor. The problem with that is we're now going to overexpose the image and have a light washed out looking image. So what we're looking for is making sure that we get the shutter speed right. Now in reality, of course, we control our cameras using the shutter speed and aperture, so we're actually balancing the two. So why would we think about using shutter speed? Well, shutter speed actually has some great things that you can do with it. Let's imagine we're photographing a racing car around a racing track. That car is moving really quickly, so we need what's known as a high shutter speed to actually freeze the action, make that car look as if it's frozen in time. To do that, we need a shutter speed maybe 1/500th of a second or 1/1000th of a second. And to counterbalance that, we need to use our wider aperture. Conversely, if we're working in an area where it's very dark, low light, say it's a city scene at night, you want to capture the lights, then our cameras are not going to be able to cope with it. So we need to use a slow shutter speed. And the problem with slow shutter speeds is as you keep the shutter open, say for 1/15th of a second, 1/10th of a second, for a long period of time, you're actually moving. Your camera is moving on your hands, so you're actually getting a blurring effect, a motion effect if you like. So what do? We use a tripod. By using a tripod, we make sure that the camera is fixed in one solid position so that when our shutter opens for that low shutter speed, it doesn't move. So the only thing that actually moves in the picture are any elements moving through the pictures, cars, etc. And by using a slow shutter speed, for instance with a car coming through the picture, you will get that light stream effect that you often see in images of car light trails in cities, etc. It's a great effect. So lastly, let's have a look at the ways that we control the shutter speed on our camera. Now if we simply stick our cameras on program mode, the camera will decide what shutter speed and what aperture that it wants to use. It takes in the scene and thinks, yeah, this is this and this is what shutter speed, this is what aperture we'll use. There is a way of using an automatic mode just by setting the shutter speed, and that's called shutter priority. And what you do here is you set the shutter speed that you want to set. For instance, you're at a racetrack and you want to shoot that car that's going fast. So you're going to set your shutter speed to 1/500th of a second. Your camera will then work out how much light there is and then open the aperture to suit the shutter speed. If it can't open the aperture anymore, it will increase the film speed to suit that shutter speed. Conversely, if you wanted to shoot, again, like we said earlier, a low-level light scene, you stick your camera on the tripod, you set your shutter speed to, say, 1/10th, 1/5th of a second, and your camera will work out what aperture you need. The other way, of course, to set your shutter speed is to go completely manual. That way, you set the shutter speed most suitable for the image that you want to create. For instance, you're shooting a bird flying through the sky, you're going to use a nice high shutter speed, but you're going to need to work out the exposure. So when you look through your viewfinder, you will see a little graph inside your viewfinder. Your shutter speed is set for 1/500th of a second, but there's a little line on the far left of the side or the far right, depending on your camera, showing you that you're underexposed or you're overexposed. You now use your aperture dial to bring that little mark into the center. That's balancing the exposure. That means you've preset your shutter speed and then set the aperture to suit. Shutter speed is one of the most fundamental things that you need to learn, and by learning it you can have an incredible amount of control over your images. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you again next time.